The Apartment by Jules Sanderson, read by Jules Sanderson. And I'm reading this tonight for FionaDobson.com. The Apartment. I'd bought the apartment when I was still a bachelor, a speculative investment I could ill afford. Having a place near the centre of town was not only convenient, I was hoping to cash in on the gentrification of the run-down area, which sadly never came. That was 30 years ago, can you believe it? As I parked my car on the broken concrete of the car park, I looked up at the tired old facade of the building. I don't think it had ever been exactly beautiful, but for the last 5 years it had remained empty, following a fire. Once upon a time it had been quite an imposing building, I suppose. "You've seen better days," I said quietly as I stepped from my car, though God knows when. Even when I bought the place it was dilapidated. I figured I'd flip it pretty quickly. But it turned out there were problems with the title deeds. The original surveying had been inaccurate. Selling it got put off while the legal issues were addressed, but as they dragged on over the years, my life took its own course. And one way or another, things just got put off. And of course then there was Megan. Megan was a ready-made wife. She came with one child, a large suburban house, 2 cars and a small boat. I got her online. Well, that's how it all seems anyway. It's not like I got her on Craigslist, but I did start dating her from an online dating service. And things moved very swiftly. I went from carefree bachelor to married suburban husband and father in record time. We spent a few nights at the apartment when dating, but she told me she just felt more comfortable in her own place. Like a dutiful boyfriend, I acquiesced, and to be honest, it was nice to get away from the sounds of the building. There were quite a few low-income families in the old place, and the noise never seemed to end. In those old buildings, the sound insulation was pretty primitive. If the neighbours were struggling, you'd hear all about it. While I wasn't without sympathy, it wasn't quite what I'd expected when buying the place. Within a few years, most of the building had either been abandoned or squatted by homeless families. Shadowy figures would come and go, night shift workers, people trying to make ends meet, and eventually people buying drugs from several of the apartments. The neighbourhood was caught between trying to come back from the brink and finally giving up the ghost. With the arrival of a daughter of my own and the growth of my business, I gradually spent less time at the apartment until it became an afterthought. I kept the place secure and clean, but my visits became less and less frequent, until they more or less stopped. That is, until that unusual day, a little over 10 years ago. I remember it well, because it was the turning point for several aspects of my life. After Megan's car had disappeared around the bend that morning taking her to work, I'd returned to the house planning to work from my home office that particular day. For some reason I had to go back to the bedroom. I think it was to retrieve a USB drive from my jacket pocket, something like that. And there on the bed lay a blue pleated skirt. I placed it over the chair that sat facing the mirror and Megan's dressing table. I really thought nothing of it at that moment, but as I rifled through my jacket pockets, looking for the drive, I glanced over at Megan's side of the bed. A copy of Cosmopolitan lay by her bedside light. The magazine was open at a page on which a model wore the very skirt I'd just moved. It was lovely, with pleats and a rich fabric. I walked over and picked up the magazine, noticing Megan had scribbled some figures, sizes probably. At that time, of course, I had no idea how women measured themselves or figured out sizes. The model was striking, but a little manly, I thought. I also noticed that by strange coincidence she wore a cable-knit white sweater exactly like the one I was wearing as I looked at the picture. I later thought that the coincidence was a form of synchronicity about which my life after that day would swing. I can trace the root of what subsequently happened to that precise moment, as I stood there, looking at the page of Cosmopolitan, just as I still do from time to time, the torn-out page of the magazine still folded in the drawer of my bedside table. I won't try to guess what came over me. I took the magazine and lay it on Megan's dressing table. Then, standing in my jeans and sweater, I held the skirt against myself. In the mirror, I could see I looked a little broader than the model, but all the same there was something there. I decided to try the skirt on, as I thought I would get a better idea if I could imitate the woman. Then, looking for the right posture, I tried a pair of Megan's shoes. They were far too small. However, an idea was forming. I could try to imitate the picture, take a photo of myself, and then present it to Megan one day as a joke. Well, that was the idea anyway. I spent the rest of the day trying to match myself to the picture. I tried some of my wife's makeup, making a mess of my face, but I persevered. Eventually, after taking several pictures, I sat back in an armchair and relaxed. It was mid-afternoon, and I'd spent the whole day playing with women's clothes. I decided to pour a glass of wine and relax before tidying up. I lay back in the chair with the sweater, the skirt, my wife's panties and nylons and heels. As I sipped the wine, I found I was more relaxed and peaceful than I had been in years. As I stood up and caught sight of my reflection, I stopped suddenly, shocked by the person that I saw reflected. She was definitely female. I sat down quietly for a moment. Could that have been real? I would swear a woman's face had looked back at me from that reflection. I got up, hurried to the bathroom, and looked at myself in detail. Of course, it was just me, regular old Jeff, who could have shaved better this morning. Of course it was, and I'd merely imagined what I had seen. That roll of film was never developed. With all that happened after, it's funny that it survived. And it's in the drawer by my bed, along with the page from Cosmopolitan. Of course, it's all digital now, and I suppose the images on that film are far too old to bother with being processed, even if you could find someone to develop the film. It's all just history. Several days later, I realized I wanted to dress again. It wasn't hard to recognize the feeling simply because it felt so urgent. The desire to dress and to relax, as I had, was overwhelming. Too shy to discuss the matter with my wife, I simply bought a few items, and the next night took the opportunity to look in on the old apartment. Once there, I changed, opened a bottle of wine I'd bought for the occasion, and settled down for a quiet evening. I worked at my laptop for a little, enjoying the clothes and the moment. I don't know if the relaxation was the solitude or the wine. Well, yes, I do. But it was more than that. It was realizing that I was being myself for the first time in as long as I could remember. The apartment became the place I'd visit now and then, just to dress. I might work a little, or simply listen to music, but I'd always dress. I could be myself here. A sort of man cave, but someone who was not quite the man he thought he was. Megan took it in her stride. I had a few projects to do at the apartment, and it was perfectly reasonable that I'd be there sometimes. It's going to look nice if I replace the skirting board, I'd say. Or the shelves are disintegrating. If I replace them, it'll be much more comfortable. I know she didn't have any interest in the apartment, and who could blame her? I think if I'd done all the things I claimed to be doing at the apartment, I might have found myself living in a palace. But they were just excuses. I'd dress whenever I had the opportunity. In the apartment, I was accepting the woman within me. A part denied for so long. But here I could be the person I was meant to be. I soon became proficient in makeup and acquired a lovely wig. Wearing heels that actually fitted was a joyful discovery too. And the sounds of a chaotic world, I was finding my own peace. And it was chaos, increasingly so. I'd hear fights, people's televisions, and it seemed that the pipes carried the sound from an apartment upstairs directly to the living room. That the family up there had a nursing child that seemed to cry every 10 minutes was less than good fortune. But you know how it is. Eventually you block things out. They become something so distant, they go unheard. There was something haunting about that child, though. I only ever heard the poor thing. In those moments of femininity, some maternal... But no, I'm just being a little too fanciful. In the 5 years since I'd last set foot in the apartment, there had been evictions, a fire, a notice to all tenants to clear the building and prepare it for demolition, and after some empty apartments had been squatted by a group of homeless people, the building had finally been locked up and condemned. A family had died in the fire, or so I heard. The structure was permanently weakened. It felt quite eerie entering the property now to retrieve the last of my belongings. I don't really know what brought me here, really. After all, it wasn't as if I really needed any of the clothes here. I had alternative arrangements now, besides. All the same, I felt I wanted to clear the place rather than have some stranger finding my clothing. I know it doesn't sound very rational, does it? But these things are very personal. For all I knew, they'd just send in a wrecking crew and bulldoze the rubble. And yet I still wanted to remove those few items. As I turned the key in the lock, I was surprised to find it still opened the heavy front door. There was no power on, so as I stepped inside, the only sound seemed to be my footfall on the concrete floor, some broken glass making it scrunch as I walked to the stairs. My apartment was on the first floor, and as I climbed the stairway, I was aware how every step echoed around the building. Outside it had begun to rain, and the sun was slowly setting. As I stepped into the apartment, I could smell the damp, but the setting sun streamed in through the west-facing window, painting the wall a soft apricot. Yes, it had always been quite nice at dusk. I opened the glass doors on the balcony, and fresh air wafted in. An old chair, some books, a kettle, a few other items lay about the place, nothing really of value. In the bedroom was a handful of skirts and blouses, all carefully hanging. I take good care of the things I care about. In a drawer, some nylons and lingerie, not particularly fancy. In a moment of inspiration, I decided to put the black evening dress that hung with the other, more practical clothes on. I shed my man-wear and swiftly pulled on some panties, slid into the dress, and it seemed to cascade about me as I put it on. Silk, or something close to it, silk-ish. In the bathroom there were a few items of makeup. I decided to keep it simple and just applied a little lipstick. There was one bottle of beer in the fridge, though it hadn't been running for the last few months. I opened the bottle, sniffed it cautiously, and then had a sip. It was okay. As I stepped out onto the back balcony and settled on a chair in the dusk, I lifted the bottle to my lips and smiled. Peace at last. I sat there quietly. For a moment I dozed off, I think. I was a little out of breath from climbing the stairs. Silly, I shouldn't be, but lately I've not been looking after myself. I have some tests scheduled. Well, I'm not as young as I used to be, after all. I remember feeling quite dizzy. But it was peaceful. Very peaceful. Well, I would say peace. But as I sat there and listened to the traffic, eventually I noticed something odd. That sound. I could hear it quite plainly. I knew the sound from years of determined effort not to hear it, but there it was. There was no doubt about it. I could hear the sound of a baby crying. And it sounded to me like it was coming from the apartment upstairs. Now I know what you're thinking. Creepy, right? No, obviously someone else had come in and was cleaning out their last few belongings. A young mother. Probably salvaging the last things before they, like me, said goodbye to the old building and cleared out. Or maybe someone was taking it right down to the wire and hadn't moved out after all. Though living in a condemned building without power would be an odd choice, particularly for a new parent. But you never really know these days. I enjoyed my beer, took a last look around, and then packed a few belongings into a large suitcase that was in the cupboard. after switching out of the evening dress, and I admit I did feel a little silly as I looked one last time in the bathroom mirror, as ever surprised to see that feminine part of me reflected. Finally, I was ready to leave. I took the suitcase to the door. Realizing there was no point locking the door now, I tossed the key on a table, walked out, and left the door wide open. Who knows, perhaps the parent of that crying child would come past and maybe find something they wanted there. A chill ran down my back as I walked to the stairs. It was as if a pair of eyes were watching me. I turned and almost screamed as I saw right down the far end of the corridor a teenage girl. She was staring at me as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. After my initial surprise, I clutched at the banister and steadied myself. I regained my composure and tried to feel calm, though my heart was racing. "Hello," I called down the corridor. "You clearing out the last of your stuff too?" She stood motionless, her mouth hanging open as she stared at me. "It's okay," I said, realizing that perhaps she was afraid. "I'm just getting the last of my stuff too." As I looked at her, I realized there was something wrong. What is it?" I called. At that, she turned and ran. Just like that, she disappeared through a doorway, which I knew was a service stairway to the floor above. I stood there looking at the end of the corridor. Was it possible that she didn't know the building was condemned? Perhaps tomorrow, when the bulldozers came, she could be hurt. I felt an overwhelming sympathy for the waif-like girl in her simple dress. Something wasn't right about all this. I left my suitcase and walked up the next flight of stairs. Perhaps I'd see her there. I could explain. She needed to know it wasn't safe here. My footfalls echoed as I climbed the stairs. "It's okay," I called out. "I just want to talk." I heard a door swing closed just as I stepped onto the second floor. Looking down the corridor, it was easy enough to see which one it was. There was fire damage. Still that black charcoal residue on the walls by one of the apartments. The door hung off the hinges. I don't know if I actually heard sounds coming from the apartment, or whether I just sensed them. Either way, I knew she was there, and I stepped nervously into the doorway. "Hello?" I called. There was no reply. I could see the blood red of the last of the sunset through the broken glass doors to the balcony. It was getting dark now. I glanced around. This must have been where the fire started. There were burn marks everywhere. But it was the kitchen that must have done it. Broken countertops, something that must have once been a stove, the carcass of a fridge. I looked, and even as I tried to look away, I found the scene was sucking me in. I turned and looked across the living room to the doorway to a bedroom. I pushed the door open and immediately regretted it. There, in the blood red of the sunset, was a crib. A rag or two of fabric still hung from it. It was then that it dawned on me. This was the apartment, directly above my own. How many times had I heard the cries of that child through the pipes? It must have been just above my head. I don't know why I walked into that room, I really don't. But I found my steps moving toward the crib. I say it like that because it seemed no longer my voluntary actions. My feet moved, and I merely followed. And there I was, standing above the crib. I tried not to, but I couldn't help myself as my eyes dropped to stare into the little bed. And that was when I saw the dried up, desiccated little body. Its head turned to one side as though in sleep, or maybe mid-cry. Jaw was open. All skin had long since dried or melted away, and all that was there were the desiccated remains of an unnaturally small human baby. Premature? Disfigured? I don't know. I stared, unable to look away. All I could do was try to take it in and process it coldly, trying not to think of the tiny crying form, its panic at the sight of flames, and its futility at trying to escape. Where's my mummy? I turned I had to get away from this place, and as I did so, I came face to face with the ragged girl. She was right there in the doorway. "Why are you here?" she said in panic. Getting my stuff," I blurted out. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. "I have to leave." A moment of eased tension followed, and then, to my surprise, she smiled. I couldn't think what the hell there was to smile about. There was a dead body here, and the girl. And yet I was aware of something, a sense of acceptance, of resignation. "You have to leave, do you?" she said, and stepped back into the living room. I followed her, forcing myself to relax a little, trying to think straight. She stepped out on the back balcony. I followed her. "You have to leave, do you?" she said, and turned to look at me. I looked out at the sunset. In spite of everything, I was aware how beautiful it was. She looked over the edge, and I found myself following her gaze. There below us I could see the form of a man in a woman's dress. A half-empty beer was by the table before him. He looked content in his state, eyes open, stock still, and as dead as the child in the crib. "No one gets to leave," said the girl. This has been Jules Sanderson for FionaDobson.com, wishing you a wonderful Halloween.